What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another LUMIX Live. I've got an interesting stream for everybody today. Normally, a lot of times we're talking about, the internal recording options that you have in the cameras and the photography side and typically the things that you do with the camera as like kind of a self-contained unit. But this week, I wanted to take a little bit of a separate time here because we've had a number of people ask us about some of the more advanced or out there kind of things that you can do with the S5 Mark II X, with cameras like the GH5 Mark II, but then also just refresh some of the things that I've seen come up over the last week when it comes to things like Blackmagic RAW on the GH6, the raw output over HDMI in general, and then also clear up some stuff about the GH6 with the standard video output that camera's capable to do. So we got a kind of a relatively wide range of things that we're going to talk about today. And as always, just let us know whatever kind of questions you have. Since we're going to be a little more free-flowing in the topics, I've got a couple demonstrations to show you. If you have the questions, drop it in the chat, tag at LUMIX USA so I can see it and we can kind of go through it. So think of this as a bit of the, kind of hybrid version of an AMA plus some more of that, kind of demo stuff. But we'll definitely be leaning pretty hard on some of the AMA stuff because I know there's been a lot of questions. I've seen them in the Facebook groups. I've seen them on our Instagram account. And yeah, we'll kind of go from there. But yeah, if this is the first time you've joined us, these are weekly broadcasts that we do every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we give you the opportunity to speak directly to us, the brand, and get your questions answered. We typically try to answer as many questions as we can. Obviously, there are some things that I cannot answer, either because I don't have the information or I can't answer certain questions that some people have. But yeah, this is all about the community and about what you all want to learn, what you all want to see with these cameras. So as we go through the stream, if you see something that I'm kind of covering and you want to get more detail about it, just drop it in the chat and we can always circle back, go, more in depth in some different topics. Before we go too far into this, I want to remind everybody LUMIX Pro services here in the United States. We have the Red and the Platinum tier available. The Red is free. If you've purchased a LUMIX camera, get yourself registered for LUMIX Pro Services Red. You can follow the QR code on the screen, or you can follow the link down in the description. If you're someone who likes maybe a little bit higher level of service, check out our Platinum membership for LUMIX Pro Services. That gets you things like 2-day repairs with next day shipping both ways. You get 20% off out of warranty repairs, so if something is broken, you can get it in there and get some discount on the repair service there. You also get an exclusive hotline, you get a membership card and welcome package, all that kind of fun stuff, and you get your annual sensor cleanings, calibration, stuff like that, if you're someone who likes to get your equipment ready before your season starts. So yeah, with that, let's kind of jump into this a little bit. I see a couple of people are here. A little more low-key this week than we've been in the previous weeks. So let's see here. Update S5 Mark II 4K 120. Unfortunately, not possible. The sensor in the S5 Mark II and Mark II X doesn't support 4K 120. All you want is a GH7 with PDAF and enough codecs. Can understand that. Let's see here. Dennis says, will you be going over the benefits of the new firmware update that gives BRAW for the GH6? That is partially one of the things that I do want to talk about because I think there's been some questions about, like, what's the benefit of it? There's a lot of questions about the advancements that happen with the GH6 and the S5 Mark II and the Mark II X and what they can do in Blackmagic RAW that the other cameras can't, so I want to talk about that as well. So yeah, hang in there. We will be going over that as well. D Creative says, can you go over focus peaking sensitivity settings and white balance adjustment? Yes, I can. We definitely can do that. And then Jack says, when is the next photo event / show LUMIX is participating in? Thanks. That's a good question. In the United States, trade shows are a little different right now. I believe... So we were just at Cinegear. The next major show that I know of that's at least in general coming up would be a show like Adobe Max. Not really photo video related, so I don't know if that's a show that we're going to be at. Other than that, I think it's not many until basically CES probably. If you've looked, at least in the US, and this is where I can only speak for the US, many of the trade shows that we used to do, so like Photo Plus, WPPI, Imaging USA, some of them are still around. We haven't really ever gone to a number of those shows, but we are always looking to see, do we want to go back to them? And they're all kind of still being figured out right now. But I do know that the main show, what was Photo Plus, is no longer there. So unfortunately, that's not going to be a show that we're at. Or whatever it's called now. So yeah, for any local presence that we're going to be at, if you check out our Facebook page, we do have events. We do post them there when we're going to be at different dealers throughout the U.S. So if they're a big enough event, we'll post them there. Otherwise, check with your local dealer if you want to see one of our reps in person and kind of check out the equipment there. Otherwise, major shows, just keep an eye on LUMIX Live. Keep an eye on our social channels. We'll let you know when we're going to be at different shows. Is LUMIX done with the BGH1? Actually, no. We've posted some actual recent firmware for it. The last firmware we posted was in February. Made some more updates for a lot more of the studio multicam use cases for it. If there's stuff that you want to see on those cameras, let us know. Let us know in the chat, and we're happy to kind of pass it on to the engineers, see if it's stuff that can be done, if it's stuff that's already being planned, that kind of stuff we can always kind of go through. Let's see here. My S5 IIX on switch light never... okay, never HS come on. Is that a setting? I assume you mean the light on the top of the camera, the power light. The power light, by default, does not turn on these cameras anymore. It turns blue when you have a network connection, so it's not something that you're doing. I'd have to dig back through the menus, because honestly, I can't remember the last time we had a camera that had the light turn on when power was on. But I can dig through and see here. Andy says, was the new real-time LUT feature added in the GH6 firmware? No, unfortunately it was not. Real-time LUT is not part of the GH6 at this time. I don't know if or when it would be coming to the GH6. Because honestly, I don't even know if it can come to the GH6. So, cool. So we got the first round of questions out of the way. So, yeah, as we said, I wanted to talk about a couple of the kind of more advanced output options, because we've had a lot of people ask these questions, and I've seen a lot of these questions start to pop up on the different Facebook groups. So with the S5 Mark II X and with the GH5 Mark II, you probably noticed that we have the ability to do RTSP and RTMP streaming. So that is the wireless or wired streaming that allows you to not have to go through encoding software necessarily, not have to use HDMI output to send your video feed out, and gives you a little more flexibility to be able to have the camera out in the field, connect into a network, and then send your footage directly into things like Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, any other kind of RTMP service. And on the GH5 Mark II, we've done a number of live streams with it actually out in the field. But now we have the S5 Mark II X, so we have a full-frame camera that's capable of doing this as well. So I figured now is a good time to actually go through and talk about how it works, how you set it up, what you want to look out for, and give you some recommendations for how to use it if it is something that you want to play around with and kind of, use in your particular case. So because of that, I've got my S5 Mark II X hooked up. Let me turn my lights on here because I forgot to charge them, so I want to make sure I have enough light. And yeah, so right now we're just looking through my S5 Mark II X. I've got it hooked up over HDMI, so and with the user interface on, so we can actually see everything that's going on and kind of walk you through. So to start with, wireless and wired IP streaming are technically two separate things that this camera can do. And it's because you get into them from 2 or 3 different ways. And I say 2 or 3 because there's a couple ways that kind of duplicate each other, depending on how you want to work with the particular setup. So for starters, we're going to talk about the RTSP option here. So RTSP, if you're not up to date with it, RTSP is the ability to send the video feed and audio feed out from the camera for use to be put into something like VLC, into OBS or Streamlabs or any other kind of program to capture that video feed. Now, with the S5 Mark II X and the GH5 Mark II, this is something that can be done by simply purchasing an extra accessory for your camera that, if I can get it up on screen here, is, because I just disconnected my network, is one of these little things here. So this is a USB-C to Ethernet adapter. This is the one that we've actually tested, worked with on the camera. It's from Anker. Just a simple USB-C to RJ45 connector. What this does is this allows me to take a standard Ethernet cable, so one that I just got plugged into my switch here, connect it in, and then plug this direct into my S5 Mark II X. So let me re-plug this back in. Now, the option that you have here is to go into the actual camera itself and enable that you want to actually use that as your network tool for here. So you would do that by going down into the settings, go into your in and out one, and then go down into USB. For this case, because I'm using an Ethernet adapter, I need to tell the USB port, hey, you need to be functioning so that you can take the Ethernet signal and the protocols and everything that you need for this. You need to actually enable to run that way. The USB port on the S5 Mark II X and on the GH5 Mark II run in 2 or 3 different modes. You have either the USB power delivery option, so that is where you plug in a 9-volt 3-amp adapter, and that can deliver power and charge the battery at the same time. You have a data mode where it will function in the S5 Mark II X's case as the ability to send footage over USB-C and store that onto an external drive. Or you have this here, you have the option to do the Ethernet adapter. So when you turn this on, you'll notice that, and I can't show this with the way I've got everything rigged up here, but what you'll see is that the adapter will actually now light up, and it will be connecting and communicating into your network. So once you turn that on, that part of it's pretty much set. What you have to do from here, though, is you then have to go up and do one thing first. Typically is the way I recommend it, is go into the streaming menu, and then you want to actually come down to streaming setup, and then set what stream quality you want to be going out over the Ethernet on this camera. Same as well with the GH5 Mark II. Now, you'll see that you've got every option in this particular case on the S5 Mark II X up to 4K 60, all the way down to Full HD 30p. You'll notice 24 frames per second is not part of the RTSP streaming, so if you do need to use this streaming, you're going to be at 30 or 60 frames per second. That is the common frame rates used in platforms like YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, platforms like this, where you're going to be streaming on a platform. And the reason there are so many different codecs here are all down to bitrate. So that means you've got things like, in this case, Full HD at 30p at 4 megabits per second. You've got down to 3 megabit per second in Full HD 30 as well. So you have a couple different options here to work with. And then you also have, as you start to go up higher, you have different compressions available as well. So you'll see that these are being done in H.264, and I can go all the way up to 4K 60p, and that's at 25 megabit per second. So I'm going to get a really good looking image out of it. It's an H.264, so whatever software you're going to use, you're going to want to make sure that you have hardware decoding enabled, or hardware acceleration, sorry. But you also have the HEVC compressions available as well. So I can go up to 50 megabits per second in H.264, and then as I continue to go all the way up here to H.265 4K 60p, I can output at 50 megabit per second. So if you followed bit rates before and how they interact with compressions, you'll know that if you can send out 50 megabits per second in HEVC and then 50 megabits in H.264, the 50 megabit HEVC footage is actually going to look cleaner and better than the H.264 footage will. I know that's a lot, but basically this gives you that solid option to have the highest quality possible if bandwidth limitations are of no concern for you, but then also step it down depending on the bit rate that you're capable of actually running on your particular network. And I bring this up because this is where a couple of the questions have come in for users that I've worked with that have been using this particular functionality on the camera. And that is, when you are plugging in a camera like this and you want to send 50 megabits per second out from your camera to a device to record, that's great. If you've got a gigabit network that you can work with at home, if you're 2.5, if you're 10 gig, you've got the bandwidth technically to send that footage in. But sometimes it also comes into play what else it is that you're doing on that network and what else it is that you're trying to do. So as an example, for LUMIX Live here, we broadcast out at 4K 30p now, and we're doing it at 30,000 kilobits per second, so 30 megabit per second. That would mean that if I am now also going to add my S5 Mark IIX in streaming mode out over my network and go into my computer, be processed, that means that I am also adding another 50 megabits per second on top of that 30 in data transfer through that particular port. You do want to be a little careful in this kind of case, and the reason this comes up is more if you've got multiple cameras and you're doing all of this at once and then you're sending everything out and you only have a 1 gig pipeline. You have to just be aware of how much bandwidth you're using overall. The higher the bandwidth, technically, yes, the better the quality is that you're going to send from the camera. But this is one of the other reasons why we also offer the two various different compression types. Because if you're sending, like I said before, say 6 megabits per second on HEVC versus 6 megabits on H.264, your HEVC is going to actually look a little bit better, even though you're using the same amount of data to send that footage into your computer. So, as we're going through here, for this particular demo, I'm going to bring this down a bit. I have a 2 gig download and a 1 gig upload, and I've got a 2.5 gig switch here. So I know I don't necessarily have the issue here, but I want to show you from a general user perspective, what you can kind of expect. So we're going to do full HD, 30 frames per second at H.265 compression here, which is going to give me 6 megabits per second that the stream is going to send out at. So once you've got all of this figured out, what bit rate you want to use, what compression mode you want to use on this particular setup, now you're going to come back and make sure that a couple of other things are set. That your connection method is set to LAN because that's what we've got the camera hooked up to. And then I'm just going to come up here, make sure that streaming method is via PC because I want this to send out as an RTSP stream. If I come around and I say direct, this is where I change it right to RTMP, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So we're doing RTSP. And then now all I do is I turn the stream on. So stream functionality is now turned on in this particular camera. But there's one more step you have to do with this, and it actually involves going back into the LAN Wi-Fi functionality. So this is in the in and out menu under the settings option. You're going to go to LAN Wi-Fi, go to LAN Wi-Fi setup, and then you're going to come down here and you want to make sure that you look at your network address display. So you're going to come in here and say, okay, what is the IP address that camera has been assigned? In my case, it's 192.168.1.207. So I know what this particular camera's IP address is on my network. Copy that down, keep it front and center in your mind, or write it down on a piece of paper, whatever works. Now when I half press to my shutter here, you'll see that remote recording, and actually because I just clicked record, right now I get a new icon on the actual camera. So if I move my camera here and I point to it, you see the little icon right over here. That particular icon is telling me now that the camera is set and it's basically sending a signal out, getting ready to work and send that RTSP signal out to whatever software is going to end up calling for it. So now, because I know what my IP address is, I know that the camera is ready to actually send that footage out. Now I have the ability to go into software like OBS, to go into VLC Player, to go into any number of these different programs and tell that particular software, hey, look for this camera on my network. I want that to be sent over. I want that to be read so that I can now actually work with this in the software that I want to. And that's pretty much the basis of how you get that set up. A couple things that you want to actually be a little bit aware of when you're going to be doing this is that I'm not going to cut to the camera here, because there's certain things that you want to take into consideration with RTSP versus HDMI type streaming. HDMI type streaming, you have limited delay. So you're within a handful of frames, depending on the HDMI, depending on the overhead on the recorder that you're using, on the capture card that you're going to work with, depending on if you're using software and you're going to have that software create offsets to sync up external microphones, however you want to do that. But that's going to make sure that you kind of have to figure out which system you want to kind of work with. This particular setup, the way I have our live streaming setup, is I do this over HDMI because I take the HDMI out. I use an external microphone, and I'm mixing everything separately channel-wise in OBS. When I do RTSP streaming or I do RTMP streaming, you have you have the main benefit that you get to take this extra step out of the kind of pipeline. Your audio and video are synced together, and they're coming through together as they get into the actual recorder or program that you're using. Because of that, RTSP has more delay than typical HDMI or something like UVC or some of those other kind of protocols that are used for streaming. In a case like what we do here on LUMIX Live, not as big of a deal. If I were to just basically set this thing up to do RTSP streaming instead of running it over HDMI, totally could. Wouldn't have a problem with it. I would just be a little bit more delayed on when I would respond to maybe questions in the chat. When I'd be looking at the screen here, I would be seeing a delay between what I say and then when I see my software actually showing it. HDMI gets me a little closer. But if you're going to be doing something where you've got multiple cameras set up and they're out of range from where you are, if you are working in a situation where you've got a camera set up as a remote, and all you need to do is just pull a video feed from this. You're not working with it necessarily as a real time to interact back with a community in a chat in real time. RTSP provides you the higher image quality with that audio encapsulated in the stream, just the same way that you get with HDMI. And in some cases, you can get equally as good video quality, if not in some ways better, depending on the capture card that you're working with. Because capture cards, you have to make sure you're buying the right one. You know, if you want to do 4K video streaming, you want to have a 4K capable capture card. If you're going to be doing, 1080p streaming, you want to make sure that it's 4K or 1080. When you do it with RTSP, you're just sending the signal over Ethernet. You're sending it over network. So you don't need to worry about what capture card. You just have to set your software up to recognize the camera's IP and what information is coming from it. It will know what resolution's coming through. So it can save you a lot of time. It can save you a lot of effort if you're going to work with it, and your image quality is going to be really high end. Just know that you would need to pick up that one little extra piece, that USB to Ethernet adapter, if you want to do it this way. RTSP does like fast, clear, network connections. It's probably one of the best things you can do with it. And the other cool thing is that you don't actually have to have an internet connection out to the real world. This can work entirely on an enclosed system. We show it off at our shows all the time. They're not connected to the internet. It's just the switch, a laptop, and the camera. This is technically the same thing that you can kind of do with the box cameras when you're using, say, like Lumix Tether, stuff like that. But I encourage you, if you've got a Mark IIX, play around with it. The adapter itself, USB to USB-C to Ethernet, they're like 25 bucks. If it's something that you've wanted to play with, if you want to work with the camera, it's a really cool, solid kit to work with for being able to not have to necessarily record over HDMI. If you need to use the camera in a more obscure setting because you want to set it up as overview, or you want to set it up as like kind of a say overall capture camera, I encourage you to play around with it. It is super fun, and as long as you're on a network, you can access the camera from pretty much anywhere, just like you would if you're going to be using like a security IP camera. Same principles, just infinitely much higher image quality. Let's see here. I see a whole lot of questions coming through, so I want to make sure that I get to some of these here. Okay, so we answered that one. Where did we go? Is firmware update through Tether coming in the future? All other Tether cameras are able to update. Oh, I think you mean using LUMIX Tether to update the cameras. I believe that is going to stay as the box camera options, because the box cameras are directly suited for that. There is back and forth, I think, when you talk to various different people as to what's preferred for firmware updating a camera. We choose to do the firmware updating on our cameras over SD cards because there is more protection built in that way. You're not going to brick your camera because of a bad cable, because of a lost connection to the software. There's less roadblocks involved with it. So interchangeable lens cameras like the S5 Mark II and Mark IIX, yeah, they're going to be on SD cards to update. You can do it through the app, through the LUMIX Sync app on your mobile device. But the LUMIX Tether, I don't know if you're really going to see it come into there for all the cameras. Is it possible with a firmware to allow us to adjust the intensity, opacity of a LUT when shooting in log, having some kind of percentage level so that it's not always at 100%? It might be possible. I'd have to check with our engineers and the team that works on the on that side of the camera setup to see what would be possible. But yeah, we can definitely present it. I can't make any promises, Carlos, but we'll definitely present it. Yeah. Candy Arts, not convinced real-time LUT couldn't be added through firmware, and Lumix needs to understand that some of us are invested in Micro Four Thirds. We shouldn't be forced to have to invest in a new system. I think that might be a little bit of a misunderstanding of what I've kind of said. I haven't said that it can't be added through firmware. I've said that I don't know if it can be added through firmware. One of the things to know is that the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark IIX are using a totally new engine to process the image and give us a lot of the capabilities. That is where real-time LUT came in. Being able to apply this over any color profile that you choose, whether it's Vlog or standard like we've talked about in the others. I do not know if it could be brought back to the GH6 since it is using a different engine than what's in the S5 Mark II and the Mark IIX. Time will tell if it is something that's going to be there. And truthfully, a feature like that is definitely not something that is there to force you to get into another camera. Believe me, Matt Fraser, myself, a lot of us that love using the real-time LUT feature, we want to see it in every camera that comes out. Reality is not every feature can always be in every camera because there can be hardware limitations, there can be profile issues that happen between the sensor that's used and the processor that's in the camera. Those are all things that engineers that work on these things day in and day out, that are designing this technology, that are actually the ones coming out saying, hey, we think we can do this. Do you think this is a good idea? They're the ones that can let us know whether or not that can happen. I can give you my word that seeing real-time LUT in more cameras is something that we want to do. Especially Matt and I, we hear what all of you have been saying. We see how awesome it is that people have been taking real-time LUT and basically doing things with it that we didn't really think people were going to do with it, and adopting it in ways that weren't really that expected. So you know that we're going to be making sure that real-time LUT is something that is carried more and more in the future. Earlier cameras, it does just come down to that question as to whether or not the hardware is set and programmed to be able to take it. But we'll always keep pushing. That's the biggest thing that I can promise to all of you, is that we will always keep pushing on the things that you request us to show you. Sean says, I had my GH6 after over a year, freak out when connected to HDMI or USB, turning the screen pink and freezing. Waiting on LPS for days after sending an email, still no response. Sean, when you sent it, when you set it up, did you submit a service request on it, or did you just send an email? Because if it's service related, you got to send a service notice in. So actually set up as if you need to send the camera in for service. If you send an email, that does not go to the service team. That goes to the LPS program support team. They're different entities. But we can double check. But yeah, you submit it as a service request. Yeah. Let's see here. Yeah, how can a person get a faster response on something like that? Yeah, it's making sure that you're submitting service, not an email to the company. Service is what is the side of the group that actually works on that, not the email group. Let's see here. We're watching again. Okay, that's there. I'd like to see 800 megabits per second all-eye or ProRes, even if it's to SSD for the BGH1. I was sold a Cinema Camera 2. Sold a Cinema Camera 2, but seems to be on live streaming. So, one thing I can tell you is SSD recording will not happen on the box cameras. It cannot happen on the S1, the S5, the S1R, S1H, the BGH1, or the BS1H. Those cameras do not have the USB port required to do the throughput that would support SSD recording. We've tried to explain that in the past, but hopefully now it kind of clears it up. Those cameras cannot get SSD recording. It's not because we don't want to, it's because hardware-wise they don't support it. SSD recording became something more important later on when we were able to put a 10 gigabit USB port into the camera. Things like 800 megabits per second all intra, we can check into stuff like that, but 800 megabits all intra and ProRes, stuff like that, a lot of times those particular options are going to come down to whether or not the camera can support it as far as the engine that's in that camera. Does it produce too much heat? Does it cause too many, is there an image quality issue to get up to 800 megabits per second? These are all factors that have to go into the different, understandings of what bit rates and what image quality is being chosen on a particular device. Truth is, if you're looking at cinema and you're looking at cinema as the standard, 400 megabits per second and an all intra is considered standard for outlets like Netflix. Typically, if you're looking at a lot of them, they're going to prefer you to shoot RAW anyway, which if you need higher quality, RAW over HDMI is what you get on the box cameras. But 800 megabits per second versus 400 megabits per second, there's a little bit of a difference, not a crazy difference between them, but 400 is still where that camera is basically set. I don't know, and I kind of doubt that 800 megabits would be able to be done, because if it was able to be done, we would have done it already on those cameras. Let's see here. I really need to upgrade to new kit. Direct to SSD sounds amazing. From Aware. Yeah, SSD recording direct can be a really awesome tool. It's just really solid depending on how you want to rig your camera up and how you want to work with it. Let's see here. Can you use the mobile app for firmware updates? On certain cameras you can, not all of our cameras. The newest cameras, so the S5, S5 Mark II, S5 Mark II-X, I believe the GH6 you can do it. I have to double check on that one. The LUMIX Sync app will give you a notification that says, hey, a firmware download is available. And you do want to make sure that you get your camera connected to it. Once your camera's been connected to LUMIX Tether the first time, it will know that you've got a firmware update for your camera. And you'll get the notification for it. Yeah. Let's see here. Bob, Could the GH5, GH5 Mark II, and other cameras get timecode sync via flash port like the GH5S or GH6? Unfortunately, no, because they are not. They don't have the hardware required for timecode sync over the flash port. That's a whole design change on those particular cameras, the GH5S, the GH6, the S1H, to utilize that port to be able to, get it into there. Let's see here. Did you find the part number for the GH6's cable protector and where to get it from? Also, I sent you an email. I will have to check the email and the Instagram messages. I have not taken a look, Redframe. I will take a look. As far as the GH6 cable protector, I have not been able to get a part number for that. I will check again with our service team to see if there is a part number for it, if it is an available part out of the box. And see what I can find for y'all. At this point, I don't have a part number available yet. Let's see here. Kudo, can iPhone 14 features on my iPhone 10 via firmware? Different chat. Where were we? Real-time load is a cool feature. Should become an industry standard. I would love it for it to be an industry standard. Bob says, also, GH6, can we expect ProRes LT to CF Express and ProRes Proxy to SD for backup? ProRes LT you probably won't see in our cameras because our 400, 600, and 800 megabits per second all intra on the GH6 are equivalent to ProRes LT. They're about what your bit rates would be anyway, and they're the same kind of compression. And they are equally able to be worked with in the various softwares. So ProRes LT at that point is just a name as far as capabilities go. ProRes proxies to SD, I don't know. We've asked about proxies coming to cameras. That would be really cool. I don't know if it's doable at this point, so I'm just really not sure if things are just able to be done yet on that stuff. So we'll have to kind of keep our ear to the ground and see. But at this point, I know that there aren't any of our cameras that support proxy in the LUMIX lineup. In our camcorder and our cinema line, we do have cameras that support proxy. But if there are more requests for proxy, it makes it easier for someone like Matt and I to be able to bring those conversations to the engineering team to point out that, hey, this is something people want to see. And those in particular, requests like that, features like that are what, if you're able to put those as comments after these videos, as actual comments, not in the chat, that gives Matt and I a reference point to say, hey, watch this video, check the comments, this is what people are actually asking for. It gives a little more credibility when we go into the conversations and say, hey, we're being told we want this, when we can point out and say, hey, look, these are the people asking for it. Because the truth is, like I said, all of you have a voice in what gets built and what gets developed on our cameras. The more you give us recommendations, the more things you want to see from these cameras, the easier it is for us to be able to go up to bat for you and get this stuff. It's a pretty solid thing that we try to do with the brand and try to allow you guys to have the voice in the company. So. Let's see here. For SSD recording on currently unsupported cameras, you need a Blackmagic Video Assistant and Atomos Ninja 5. Yeah, so one alternative, if you don't have an SSD recording available on your camera, you have it over HDMI to a recorder. It's a little bit more bulky, but there are some options there. Let's see here. File system is read-only. Did I miss a step, or is there an error in the manual? Raven. Raven, could you clarify what the file system is read-only for me to address? I'm not sure what you're doing and what is telling you that file system is read-only. Let's see here. CX350 has proxy options. Yep, that's one of our Pro Series camcorders. Proxy side by side with H.265 would be awesome. Good to know. What's the highest frames per second that autofocus works on the GH6? 200, 240 says AFC is on but doesn't work. Works fine at 100, 120. I believe... I don't have my GH6 on me at the moment, so I can't test it exactly this second. Let me do some tests, and I will let you know, Kudo. Let's see here. Let's see here. You're really good at reciting this stuff. It seems like I've seen like 3 Lumix lives, and you say the whole thing about leaving comments a lot. It is true. It is the biggest thing that helps us. If you leave comments, it lets us give a point to our engineers to read and see what you guys want in the cameras. Maybe the SD card switch is on read-only? Okay, maybe I'm missing part of a conversation in the chat here from Raven. Give me a second, everybody. I'm just going to look through the chat here, see if I'm missing something here. Yeah, I think I'm missing some of this stuff. Okay, yeah, it looks like I'm missing part of the conversation there. So what Charles says, is Lumix team planning to do any decent updates or changes to the original Lumix S5? So if you've been around long enough, you also know that there's not really much I can say about future firmware or updates that are coming, whether or not they are or aren't coming. We are supporting the cameras, especially as we move forward, so it kind of just depends on what can be added to those cameras, what needs to be worked on the new platforms, what can be brought back, what can't be brought back. These are all things that go on back and forth right now. I will tell you that right now we are focusing a lot on the whole kind of concept that this is a new phase for Lumix, that we are doing a lot to push this new segment forward on what we're able to do with the new cameras. That does not mean that the old cameras are being left behind. Like I said, we did just release the update on the GH6 with Blackmagic Raw, so that's a previous generation camera, and we're gonna kind of continue going down that route as we move forward. So I had seen one of the other questions that came up before was going over the benefits of B-Raw on the GH6. And like I mentioned, with Blackmagic Raw, there are obviously, whether or not you're in the Blackmagic Raw camp or you're in the ProRes Raw camp, or even if you're in the internal recording camp, so H.264, H.265 compressions, Raw video over HDMI does give you some inherent benefits across the board. One, you are getting much, much higher bit rates on those particular video files, depending on the compression you use, the resolution, the frame rates, whatever it is that you're going to work with. So you can take a look at, I believe it was last week's video where we actually walked through, and was it last week or the week before? Where we actually go through the GH6 specifically with B-Raw. But to bring some clarity here, there's a lot of people that have been asking Blackmagic Raw on the GH6, on the S5 Mark II, and the S5 Mark IIX have the ability to do something that the other cameras cannot. And that is the ability that in DaVinci Resolve you are able to enable the highlight recovery option. Now, highlight recovery, just to be clear, is not a silver bullet for dynamic range and protecting highlights. Highlight recovery in Blackmagic Raw does require you to at least have some of the information still kept in the highlights. If you clip all 3 channels of the color, hell, if you clip 2 of the 3 channels in color, you're not really going to be able to utilize highlight recovery. It's not going to work. You're going to get weird color casts. It's going to cause more negative to your image than potentially is worth it. But this is a capability that the new L-squared engine brings on the S5 Mark II and the Mark IIX, and the newer engine that we were using on the GH6 prior to the launch of the S5 Mark II and Mark IIX. That is the sole reason we are able to do the highlight recovery functionality, and why there is a difference in Blackmagic Raw on the newer cameras compared to the older cameras. So if you've got a camera like an S1 or you've got a camera like an S1H and you want to be able to do all the same stuff that you can do on an S5 Mark II or a Mark IIX in Blackmagic RAW, it's just not there. You have to go to the new cameras, the new engine, the new platform to get those benefits, because the engine is what's delivering those capabilities to it. Unfortunately, that's just the case. We've asked about seeing if it could get brought back to the older setups, but unfortunately, it's just not possible. Now, aside from that, some of the different benefits here. If you're someone who's coming from always recording internal, but you want to play around with recording external and you want to know what recorder and stuff to go with, Blackmagic RAW brings you a ton of extra functionality. I mean, it gives you the ability to adjust white balance in post. It gives you a much better ability at adjusting your exposure. As we said, if you're decent with your exposure and you're not fully clipping out your highlights, highlight recovery is an option that you can also utilize as well. These are all things that give you an overall better looking image. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't get good results with the internal recording. It's just, it's just more options. RAW over HDMI workflow or working with any RAW video is going to be harder. So you can't just slap a LUT on it and expect it to be good out of the box. You have to actually really work with that footage. If you're someone who prioritizes the cleanest looking footage you can possibly get out of camera, RAW and ProRes and Vlog are probably not your friend. RAW footage, ProRes footage, and Vlog footage have very little, if any, noise reduction applied to the footage that's coming out, to the actual raw data that's being sent out. And that means that you typically will get maybe a slightly noisier image, that if you're someone who wants the cleanest possible thing, you're going to have to run it through denoising software. That's just a fact of how the stuff works. If you are perfectly cool with doing the editing side of it, which is, for some cases, is actually a lot of fun, then yeah, the benefits you get are a lot more flexibility. Technically, you can get better... It's not dynamic range, because dynamic range is the same. There is no such thing as better dynamic range in RAW versus what we do internally. It is the same dynamic range. The difference is how hard you can push and pull the footage to stretch that dynamic range out, to actually get it to where it's fully visible. So it's just going to kind of depend on what your platform, what you want to do with it. If you go to something like ProRes RAW, you're going to be a little more limited in the programs that you can work with. Ideally, you'd use something like Final Cut because it integrates so directly into Final Cut. But you can work with it in Premiere, and as long as you have, at least last I checked, as long as you're using an NVIDIA graphics card, you should have absolutely no problem. I believe I've been told and seen that some of the newer AMD cards work perfectly fine as well, so you should be all right there. But then when you go on the flip side, Blackmagic RAW, that's where you start working with, DaVinci Resolve, which is kind of, considered the go-to for color grading. You can also do Blackmagic RAW in Premiere as well. You just have to make sure you download the plugin package from Blackmagic. All of those options are going to give you more control. So if you want control, that's what RAW over HDMI is for. Internal gets you a lot of control, just maybe not as much control. Let's see here. Does the GH5S have an optical low-pass filter? Does it record 4K 60 in 10-bit using the Ninja? Yeah, GH5S has a low-pass filter. It is only 11 megapixel. It does do 4K 60 in 10-bit, and you can do it internally and out to an Atomos, an Atomos recorder. Yeah. Let's see here. Where did we go? Were the S version and Mark II versions of the GH5 experimental iterations, or is that what we can expect each generation type of deal? I don't know if I'd call them experimental. GH5 Mark II was a total update of the internal systems, because the bare minimum of the stuff that we wanted to do on that camera, so including the animal detection, the human detection, the tracking mode, stuff like that, were not possible on the previous engine, so it was updated to the newest hardware. So that gives it the current state of technologies that we work with. Well, up until the newest with the L-squared engines and stuff like that. The GH5S was a specifically built product. Obviously, sensitivity is one of the #1 priorities on that camera. No stabilization built into it because the cinema production houses that were working with that camera did not want stabilization. So I wouldn't say that they were experimental. They were cameras built because of what the market and users have asked us to build. They wanted a camera that would have GH5 overall platform, but you want to have like the newer capabilities. You want the better subject detection, you wanted the better tracking, you want the in our case we were able to add the live streaming functionality to the GH5 Mark II, and then the S version specifically because the cinema side of the use cases for the GH platform couldn't stand a stabilizer. And then we worked with a number of other outlets that also really didn't want a stabilizer in a camera of that size and that capability. Red Frame says, I tested B-RAW from the GH6 this week and posted a video today, and the highlight recovery tool is amazing. The extra amount of color and information in B-RAW makes it look like there's more dynamic range. And I think you've hit the nail right on the head. It makes it look like there's more dynamic range. Because at that point, you're just shifting where your dynamic range is. Highlight recovery, as long as you're not blowing out all 3 channels, can be very useful. Once you blow out like 2 channels, it's not going to look good. But yeah, as long as you're careful in your exposure and you know that you're going to be shifting your stops that you actually have more information for up into the highlight side of the camera, you get some really solid results. And from day one, that's kind of what we've been saying with the GH6. The GH6's strength is that when you're using the DR boost modes, the dynamic range boost mode, you're getting more highlight detail and dynamic range, not necessarily shadow dynamic range. So if you're able to take that whole, like the block of dynamic range that you have and shift it up, because you want to actually bring your exposure up more, so you want to lift those shadows out of the basement, you're going to get a cleaner looking image. You're going to get more flexibility with it. And now Blackmagic Raw makes it where you've got actually a lot more control over that. So it's awesome to see that people are starting to get around there and start playing with it. It's pretty fun. Chris says, ProRes internal GH6, is it the same size as ProRes to a Ninja? I think it is. ProRes internally on the GH6, I mean, because you typically need to record to the CF Express card, or you have to do it to the SSD. Those are what are going to get you your, obviously your highest bit rates. It's 1.9 gigabit per second is the highest that we do in ProRes, at least in the camera. I think that's close to what the Ninja reports its bit rate out as. Like if you take a clip from off a Ninja and run it through like media info to get what the bit rates typically are. So they should be pretty close as far as what you get bit rate wise. I'm a noob when it comes to grading, but when it comes to getting cleaner shadows, would it make sense to have everything closer to the highlights than bring shadows down in post? And then bring shadows down in post. There's 2 things you have to consider in this particularly. So Bob's comment, bring them down in post, hiding noise, that kind of thing. That is one method that you can do with this. Exposing to the right, getting yourself all the way up there, and then bringing your shadows out, and then when you bring it into post, bringing things down. It can work. The problem is that you have to make sure that you're paying attention to where your skin tones are. If your skin tones are pushed really far out of range, and then you're starting to try to bring that stuff down, you can cause some challenges there. You can cause some shifting in what, the skin tone looks like, with the way the colors are represented, things like that. Ideally, if you are going to shoot and you want the cleanest looking footage possible, and don't flame me for this, set up your shot. Set it up with lighting. Make sure that you can try to control as much of the lighting ratio as you can to get the dynamic range you want out of an image. Clearly, that is not always possible. Being able to do setup shots where you have full control over how much highlight and shadow dynamic range and where the lights are and what the ratio is isn't really something super practical in the real world if you're in a wedding. But also kind of neither is shooting necessarily in things like RAW for things like that. RAW is where you're going to get probably the best benefit out of this. But if you just want to try to get the best grade that you can bring your highlight, you can expose to the right, get yourself closer to the highlight, but do that in situations where maybe you're not working with skin tone. If you're working in a situation where you're going to have skin tones are your primary, that is what you're trying to focus on, get your skin tones right. Then try to light so that you can get the rest of the scene lit the way you want it. That's the ideal way to do it. You can do it the other, but I would encourage you and anybody that wants to get into it. Definitely, I'm now seeing some of the comments come through. Definitely get on the Facebook groups, talk to others that are doing grading with these cameras, because there's a bunch of different techniques. There's the technical correct way to do it by metering and knowing what your lighting ratios are going to be. Then there's the way that works good enough in the field because you're run and gun, and 9 out of 10 times we all wish we could be doing it the set a shot up, make sure your lighting ratios are good, do all the exposure perfect. The rest of it, you know, it's kind of just it's going to depend on what it is that you're shooting. So GH6 with dynamic range boost, base ISO is 2000. Sometimes I swear it cleans up again at 4000 versus 3200. Is that my imagination, or is it somehow dual native ISO ish? No, it is a single gain step there at 2000. What I think you're seeing is that the way a dynamic range boost works, or the dynamic range boost works on this camera, is it's taking a highlight image and a shadowed image. So one designed for the high dynamic range, one designed for lower shadow info, and in real time it's merging those two images together to create your singular image. As you go through those ISOs, it's mixing those images together to create it. That's what these kind of processes do. There may be certain lighting scenarios that, because of the way that pipeline is coming together to create the image, you're getting a perceived better image at, say, 4000 or 3200 or these different ISOs. Doesn't mean you're going to get better dynamic range. Could be cleaner, but you're not necessarily going to get better dynamic range. 2000 ISOs where you're going to really get the best dynamic range out of using the DR boost functionality in Vlog, especially on the GH6. So hopefully that helps, Chris. And another Chris, what's up? How's it going? Okay, so he gets torches ready, all that kind of stuff. If you have control of lighting, 8-bit is just fine. Yeah, and John, I think that's actually kind of an epitome of that kind of point. If you are able to control everything about the lighting, the look, the style, all of it, 8-bit will work just fine. Because it means you don't have to do as much in post. If you're going to end up doing the heavy color grading, or you want to get really creative with the look, that's where your 10-bit really kind of goes in. Okay, cool. D-Creative. No, this is perfect. Thank you for posting this again. Can you go over focus peaking sensitivity and white balance hue adjustment function, or point me to a video discussing it? So, focus peaking sensitivity. This is actually a very good thing to kind of talk about here. So, focus peaking in our cameras, and I'm sorry for such an abrupt shift, but I definitely want to make sure I get to this topic here. So focus peaking in our cameras has a couple different things that you have control over now. And if I'm not going to be stupid, trying to remember where it is, there it is. Focus peaking has made some changes over the years that we've been, having focus peaking in the cameras. Now on cameras, so I'm on the S5 Mark II X. and I've got the focus peaking system turned on, ready to go. You have a +2, -2 in sensitivity for how this is going to be displayed on the camera. What you want to know about this is that 0 is obviously its baseline. If you go from that point, you have to determine for your particular use case, because it is going to be different for everybody. Are you having trouble seeing how defined the lines are, or are they too defined? And what I mean by that is, are they too visible or not visible enough? And the numbers here may be a little counterintuitive to what you would think they should do. If I were to take this and run focus peaking to +2, focus peaking to +2 means that if you look on the display in front of me, move that so I can actually manually focus this, you'll see that I can get focus peaking to show up. And let me actually change this color here, just so it's a little easier to see. So I can get my focus peaking to show up. I can see the color here. I'm in like 709, because that's what we're showing out in display here. Cool, I've got it. But to me, that's pretty visible. I don't know if, like, how accurate is that actually going to be? So if I come in here and I go into set and I do sensitivity down to -2, you'll see that it's much, much finer in how visible this focus peaking is. Now, the reason for this is when you look at the numbers of what it means, +2 to -2, what those numbers are telling you is how sensitive do you want it to be towards, say, like a pixel level. -2 indicates that you're actually going to have this thing set up so that you want it to be... You don't want it to be as visible because you want it to be accurate. So if you look at how I've got the focus peaking right on the lens right here, it's pretty much visible just on this lens. So I know that that particular item is what's in focus. But if I come in here and I change this back to +2, now I start to look at this and say, well, am I in focus on the lens? Am I in focus on the S5 Mark IIX behind it? Am I focused on the GM5 or GM1 that's sitting in front of it there? That's what your focus peaking sensitivity is trying to do for you. If you're having trouble seeing it, setting it to +2 can be a good thing because you're going to see it more visibly in the frame. But know that it's going to be a little less accurate because you're basically taking the threshold and you're increasing it. You're saying that it's okay to show me more because I just want a general idea of where that point is. Where when I flip this the other way around and I go to -2, I'm more accurate in exactly where my point is for gaining the actual focus point for manual focus. So that's the primary for focus peaking sensitivity. Ideally, like I said, it's going to be completely up to you which works best for you. Are you someone who prefers to be able to just see at a quick glance where your focus is, or are you someone who's going to be doing fine, detailed manually focusing because you know that you want to be, landing at a very particular point? If you're a macro shooter, I highly recommend leaving this on -2 because your depth of field can change so drastically. If you're doing portrait and fast-paced work where you're not shooting at, say, like f2, then set the sensitivity higher. But ultimately, you also want to take a look and set the colors on your focus peaking to what works best for your particular scene. As you saw it originally, I had mine set to blue, and blue, when we're sitting here in a very heavily blue-lit scene, does not look that great. If I change it to a strong contrasting color, it's much easier to see. The second part of your question was white balance hue adjustment function. So I assume what you're saying is being able to come into here and then, let me move this around, move my camera around a little bit. And then what you have control here for magenta, blue, amber, and green. these are kind of just pretty straightforward. Whatever color profile you pick, you can go in there and shift the actual hue of this. Do you want it to be magenta bluish? Do I want my image to be a little more green amber? Do I want it green blue? So on and so forth. But yeah, this gives you just the control to come in here and basically just control it however you want. These settings are going to depend on what you're trying to go for. If you're working on being fully color accurate, yep, you can use these as tools for it. If you shoot in RAW, you typically don't need to do this. If you're going to shoot in video, or if you're going to be doing this in video, I still recommend actually doing white balance calibrations. So if I were to use, grab this. If I were to use one of these, this is the color checker. Go back to my main thing. This is my color checker for video. I get a white balance card. I get my grayscale, so I can take this into the scene that I'm going to be working on. Just set my white balance on this, and it should set everything pretty much how I need it to be. Or have it in frame if you're going to shoot something like ProRes RAW or Blackmagic RAW, and then use this as a way to set your white balance in post. So let's see here. John says, I have impression with the recent update 2.3 on the GH6 was improved. It seems recording function is more responsive. Is that imagination or other undocumented improvements? The 2.3 update, obviously, as we said, it improved the or it added the Blackmagic RAW functionality. But you also get what else is in here? Improved external SSD recording functionality, which means that, well, actually, that's something we're going to talk about in a second. It also improved overall operational stability. So if you are seeing that the camera may feel a little bit snappier, that in general it just seems to work a little bit better for you, that memory cards are more compatible, stuff like that. That is what firmware update will do to the cameras as well. We document as best as we can in here without kind of going way too deep into the kind of weeds with some of this stuff. But talking about the GH6 and that particular firmware, the last thing that I actually have time to cover today is specifically to do with SSD recording on the camera. So as a lot of people have noticed with the GH6, if you wanted to record to an external SSD, so you want to use something like, I have the Condor Blue SSD handle here. If you wanted to record to that, you were limited to having to only be able to record up to 60 frames per second. And this has been a limitation on the SSD recording since day one. Most of this is pretty much down to the fact that power is a pretty heavy requirement when you're going to be outputting over USB SSD to store it into that device. SSDs need to pull power from the camera. The camera has to be able to supply that power, but the camera also has to be able to supply power for every other function that's in the camera. As you go up in resolution and up in frame rate, the power draw becomes higher. So we were able to figure out a way to work with the camera and basically say, look, if you pick up a DCC coupler and an AC adapter that allows you to power this camera externally through the battery port, you will be able to record up to 4K 120, and even in the GH6, I've been able to test it up to the full HD 240 and even the 300 frames per second VFR. You're able to record those options to the SSD as long as you're using that external power source. So as of right now, I can tell you that this is the AC10 and the DCC17. These are the formal, official Panasonic power adapters for this. We do not make any claim that a third-party battery coupler or anything like that would or can work with it. That is unfortunately something that is on your side if you choose to use those. But our adapter is designed to make this work, and I have tested it and it does work. I can do 4K 120 video recording to the actual SSDs now, as long as you're powering over an external DCC adapter or battery adapter instead of the actual internal battery on the camera. But yeah, just wanted to make sure we clear that one up. Is there a separate SSD compatibility list for the S5 Mark II X? There is. Compatibility list is... I'm actually going to pull this up and I'll drop it in the chat before I have to call the stream today, unfortunately. Here we go. SSDs for S5 2X. There you go. That's now in the chat. That has SD validation as well as SSD verification that we've done. Cool. So let's see here. Is there a way to disable the eye sensor or EVF on the S5 2X? I like hip shooting and it always triggers in the eye sensor. Yeah, if you press the LVF button, I don't know if it's going to show on this particular HDMI output. It's not. So if you press the EVF or LVF button that's on the top left shoulder of the camera, on the back you'll see that there is a it'll say LVF/MON as one of the options, because that's going to be the auto switch. You can just tap it again to where it's only going to show on the monitor. That disables the eye sensor. Or you can hit it a third time and that will only show it in the EVF and it will disable the rear monitor as well. So yeah, hopefully that helps. Outside of this, thanks you all for hanging in there. Thanks for the questions. Thanks for all the conversation that we had. As I said earlier, if you have things that you want to see us do in these cameras, if you have recommendations, if you have commentary about the features that we've added to the cameras or things that you want to see, drop them in the comments after this video so that we can reference them back with our engineers. If we didn't get to your question, don't worry. We'll be back again live next Thursday at 2 p.m. So we will be going over more questions during that particular week. Little programming note, the week after, so the last week of this particular month, I will unfortunately have to be doing a recorded stream because I will be out working on a project. So yeah, unfortunately I won't be able to be live during that particular stream, but we will be live the first week of August, so definitely come back and join us then. Otherwise, thank you all for tuning in. If you like the content, give us a thumbs up. If you liked the conversation and you feel that you've kind of earned, or you feel that we've earned a subscription from you, if you're not already, please subscribe. Share the video out to anyone that you know that may be interested in these conversations, or get them involved. Otherwise, I hope you all have an awesome rest of your weekend. I hope you go out there and create some cool stuff, and we'll see you next Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern, right here on LUMIX Live.